Step into Victorian England, where beauty was less about comfort and more about how many organs you could politely crush into an hourglass shape. The ideal woman of this age was a delicate sculpture of pale skin, tiny waist, glossy hair, and unwavering poise, a living porcelain doll who somehow managed to run an entire household while pretending she wasn't suffocating. Imagine waking each morning to the reminder that society has measured your worth in inches, 18 to be exact. Anything larger than 19 around the waist, and you risked whispers, pitying glances, or worse, being dismissed as sturdy. And sturdy, in the Victorian imagination, was only suitable for furniture and plow horses. Women were supposed to be fragile, ethereal, and on the verge of fainting at any given moment, preferably while draped in silk. But beauty was not merely corsets. It was the pale glow of a face carefully powdered with substances that would horrify any modern dermatologist. It was hair twisted into elaborate curls with hot irons ready to scorch, or dyed with chemicals that promised radiance but delivered rashes. It was hats so large they demanded engineering skills and hairpins sharp enough to qualify as concealed weapons. This was the paradox of Victorian life, a culture that preached cleanliness is next to godliness, while quietly prescribing arsenic wafers for the complexion. An age that praised women as angels of the house, but chained those same angels to clothing that made breathing optional. Beauty was celebrated, but health was optional collateral damage. And yet, beneath all this artifice, women endured. They endured the corsets, the fainting spells, the burns from curling tongs, the endless mental strain of managing appearances. They endured because to deviate was to invite judgment, and to comply was to be considered respectable. Their stories are not just about fashion, they are about survival, resilience, and the quiet rebellions that slowly chipped away at impossible standards. So tonight, we slip into that world together. You'll feel the squeeze of the corset, taste the metallic tang of arsenic-laced powder, and balance a hat large enough to shade a goat. You'll hear the whispers of gossip at a tea party, the sigh of a servant pulling corset laces tighter, the clatter of fainting couches being dragged across parlors. And in between the absurdity and the danger, you'll glimpse the courage it took to resist even in small, invisible ways. Dim the lamps, settle into your chair, and imagine yourself in a drawing room where appearances meant everything and comfort meant nothing. And if you enjoy this tour through the perils of Victorian beauty, remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It won't reduce your waist by 4 inches, but at least it won't poison you. Close your eyes and imagine waking in a Victorian bedroom, pale light filtering through heavy curtains, the smell of dust and coal smoke lingering in the air. Your first thought is not breakfast. It's not even fresh air. There isn't much of that in the London fog. No, your first thought is the corset. Because before you can face the world, before you can set foot in the drawing room or the market, you must shrink yourself into the shape society demands. A waist so small it could make a wasp blush. The corset waits, coiled on a chair like a predatory snake of whalebone and fabric. It is both armor and prison, a daily ritual of compression. Your natural waist, somewhere around 27 inches if you are healthy and well-fed, is deemed unacceptable. Society prefers you at 18, 19 if you're generous, but never 20. To achieve this miracle of subtraction, your body must yield. The laces must tighten. The ribs must bend. The stomach must flatten. The lungs must compress. And you, well, you must learn to breathe in shallow sips, like a bird pecking at air. The process is never solitary. Few women could lace themselves tightly enough without help. Enter the maid, the silent accomplice in your daily transformation. She stands behind you, bracing herself, tugging at the laces with all the strength her arms can muster. The first pull is sharp, the second sharper, until the corset creaks and your body protests. You gasp, she pulls, you grip the bedpost, and together you force inches of flesh and bone into an hourglass shape. The sound of tightening laces becomes the soundtrack of femininity. The immediate effects are unavoidable. Breathing becomes an art form. Full, deep breaths are impossible. Instead, you master the shallow inhale, the careful exhale. Never too much lest the corset remind you of its grip. Sitting is stiff. Bending is laughable. Eating is a negotiation. A meal of roast beef and pudding is reduced to a few bites, lest indigestion ruin the illusion. Pain lurks everywhere. Pressure at the ribs, aches in the back, the faint throb of organs shifted from their natural positions. Fainting couches are not symbols of leisure. They are survival tools, strategically placed for when the world tilts and your vision blurs from lack of air. And fainting was common, so common it became fashionable. To collapse gracefully at a ball, hand fluttering to forehead, was to prove one's delicacy. But behind the theatrics lay truth, oxygen deprivation, nerves strained, hearts laboring against their cage of whalebone. Women carried smelling salts like others carried fans, ready to revive themselves from the swoon corsetry invited daily. The long-term costs were cruel. Organs squeezed repeatedly, shifted positions, the liver pressed downward, the stomach twisted, intestines folded uncomfortably. Doctors of the time, those few willing to speak honestly, described displaced wombs, irregular menstruation, infertility. Skeletal deformations, too, etched their mark. Ribs bent inward, spines curved unnaturally. Girls who began lacing at 12 often grew into adulthood with chests permanently narrowed, their very bones molded by fashion. And yet, despite this knowledge, the corset persisted. Why? Because the corset was more than a garment. It was morality stitched in fabric. A tiny waist was not only beautiful, it was virtuous. It suggested discipline, control, the ability to endure discomfort for the sake of propriety. To appear without a corset was to risk scandal, whispers of looseness, the suspicion that one belonged to a lower class. Respectable women endured not for themselves, but for society's gaze. The psychological toll was as profound as the physical. Anxiety lurked in every tightening lace. Would the waist be small enough? Would the silhouette satisfy? Women became dependent not only on the corset but on the approval it earned them. Servants held power, for without their hands the transformation could not occur. And judgment was constant. A waist measured too wide risked humiliation at a ball, disappointment from suitors, even mockery in gossip columns. The body became a battleground, the corset both weapon and wound. Consider the daily routine. Wake, lace, faint, recover, move carefully through the day. Repeat. Imagine the constant awareness of your own body as fragile artifice. Imagine trying to laugh, only to find breath cut short. Imagine holding a child on your hip while ribs groan under strain. Imagine menstruation, irregular, digestion troubled, bones aching, and being told it is all worth it for the sake of beauty. Now picture the social scenes. The drawing room filled with women perched like statues, corsets stiff beneath gowns, their smiles serene though their lungs scream for air. Men glance approvingly, praising discipline, unaware or uncaring of the cost. Fainting becomes conversation. Smelling salts pass like candy, and whispers swirl about who can manage the smallest waist. The competition is relentless, invisible, yet always present. Some resisted quietly. Looser laces in private, breathing freely when no one watched. Mothers delayed the start of corseting for their daughters, though pressure mounted quickly from peers. Servants sympathetic enough to leave an inch or two of slack. But rebellion was limited, because society's grip was as tight as the corsets. To be unlaced was to be unworthy, and few dared risk the consequences. It is tempting, from a modern perspective, to dismiss this as foolish vanity. But vanity was only part of it. Corsetry was compulsion, enforced by culture, reinforced by expectation, normalized by repetition. Women endured not because they lacked sense, but because they lacked freedom. To be seen was to be judged, and to be judged harshly was to risk survival in a world where marriage often meant security. The corset, then, was not just fabric and whalebone. It was a cage built of fear, discipline, and social ambition. It carved women into shapes not their own and convinced them that the pain was proof of worth. Each pulled lace whispered, "Endure, endure, endure." And so they did, through fainting spells, through bent ribs, through whispers and sighs. They endured because to do otherwise was unthinkable, and in their endurance lies both tragedy and testament, a reminder of how far people will go to meet the standards of their time, and how deeply those standards can wound. The story of the corset begins earlier than most girls were ready for. Childhood was brief in Victorian England, and by the time a girl reached 11 or 12, she might already feel the first pull of whalebone against her ribs. Mothers, some reluctantly, some proudly, supervised the transition. The logic was cruel but persistent. If you start shaping the body early, it adapts more completely. Bones are still soft, organs pliable, posture malleable. A girl who begins corseting before puberty will grow into her curves already confined, her waist molded long before she understands the full cost. Picture a young girl in front of a mirror, her mother standing behind her, made at the ready with laces. The girl squirms, lungs still accustomed to freedom, while her mother murmurs, "Still, child, breathe shallowly. You'll thank me one day." The maid pulls, the girl gasps, her spine stiffens, and the image staring back from the mirror no longer looks like a child. It looks like an ornament, carefully arranged, already bent towards society's will. The medical journals of the age recorded cases that now read like horror stories. Doctors described livers pushed downward, stomachs compressed, ribs permanently deformed. Post-mortem examinations revealed skeletons narrowed unnaturally, lungs unable to expand fully. One physician famously displayed deformed rib cages to lecture halls, warning of the dangers, but society dismissed him as alarmist. After all, what were a few bent bones compared to the marvel of an 18-inch waist? Even outside the medical sphere, the dangers were whispered. Newspapers and satirical cartoons occasionally mocked the extremes: women fainting at the opera, corsets laced so tight they required cutting open with scissors at the end of the night, ribs breaking under pressure. Caricatures showed ladies being squeezed like sausages, their faces turning red while servants yanked mercilessly on laces. Everyone laughed at the exaggeration, but behind the humor lay truth. The corset's grip extended beyond the body into every daily interaction. At a dinner table, women nibbled delicately, careful not to overfill their compressed stomachs. At a ball, dancing demanded breath that the corset refused to give, so movement slowed, pauses lengthened, and fainting couches lined the walls to catch the casualties. Even laughter had to be measured, kept to soft chuckles, because a hearty laugh could end in coughing or dizziness. The psychological weight was immense. Imagine waking each day to know that your body would be judged by inches, and that failure meant shame. Servants, relatives, friends, everyone saw the silhouette. Waistlines were discussed the way we might talk about fashion trends today. Whose was smallest, whose was slipping, whose daughter showed promise. A girl could not escape the measuring gaze, and so she learned to internalize it, to critique herself before others did. Anxiety, insecurity, dependence, they all grew in the shadow of the corset. Mothers bore a terrible dual role. They knew the pain. They had lived the breathless days, the fainting spells, the headaches, and yet many still laced their daughters tightly, because to do otherwise was to risk their future. A girl with a wide waist might be dismissed by suitors, judged by neighbors, pitied by friends. To protect her socially, mothers inflicted the same suffering they had endured, believing it necessary armor in a world that equated beauty with survival. And yet, not all complied quietly. There were whispers of rebellion, women who loosened their stays at home, who favored rational corsets that offered more support than torture, who dared to walk in looser gowns. These small acts rarely drew admiration, they drew ridicule. But each act planted a seed, a reminder that women were not universally compliant, that the corset's reign was not absolute. The corset was more than fashion. It was discipline codified into fabric. It told women daily, your body is not yours. It belongs to the gaze of others, to the expectations of society, to the judgment of family and strangers alike. To resist was to risk being labeled indecent, unfeminine, unworthy. To comply was to sacrifice breath, comfort, and health. Between the two choices, most women chose survival endurance, even at great cost. And yet, within that endurance lay resilience. Women adapted. They fainted gracefully, carried smelling salts, and adjusted their posture to minimize pain. They found humor where they could, rolling their eyes at overzealous suitors, praising their delicacy, knowing delicacy was code for oxygen deprivation. They found solidarity with each other, sharing quiet complaints, exchanging tips for easing pain, loosening laces in secret moments. Corsetry, in the end, was not merely a garment. It was a culture, a cage, a constant reminder of how far society will go to demand beauty, and how far individuals will endure to meet those demands. It pressed not only against lungs and ribs, but against the spirit itself. And the marks it left on bones, on bodies, on minds remind us that beauty, when demanded at the expense of health, becomes its own form of violence. You have already endured the corset, lungs squeezed and ribs bent into obedience. But your suffering does not end there. Victorian beauty did not stop at the waist. It climbed onto your skin, crept into your eyes, and whispered in your bloodstream. Because what good is an 18-inch waist if the face above it does not glow with pallor? If the cheeks are not delicately tinted? If the eyes do not glisten with an unnatural shine? Step into the Victorian dressing room. The air is thick with powders, creams, and perfumes, each promising transformation, each laced with danger. On the vanity table, little jars and bottles gleam invitingly. They look harmless, even elegant. But open them, and you find arsenic, lead, mercury, ammonia. The Victorians were masters of self-poisoning in pursuit of beauty. The ideal complexion was pale, deathly pale, if possible. A face untouched by the sun meant wealth, leisure, and superiority. Tanned skin implied labor, fields, servitude. To achieve this coveted pallor, women reached for arsenic wafers, tiny white squares consumed like candy. Advertisements promised freshness and youthful glow. What they delivered was nausea, dizziness, stomach cramps, and slow systemic poisoning. Women swallowed them anyway, one wafer at a time, watching their skin fade to the desired shade of ghostly white. If arsenic seemed too daring, there were creams. Ammonia creams burned the skin, stripping oils and leaving a smooth, pale surface. The sting was unbearable. Eyes watered, noses ran, throats closed. But pain was accepted, even welcomed. It meant the product was working. Bismuth powders followed, dusted liberally across the face to even out complexion. Under candlelight, the shimmer was flattering. Under daylight, it looked chalky, almost ghoulish. Yet beauty was judged not in daylight, but in the dim glow of parlors, where powder transformed the ordinary into the ethereal. For the eyes, belladonna drops were the cruelest tool. Extracted from deadly nightshade, a plant as ominous as its name, the drops dilated pupils, giving women a languid, doe-eyed look. A single drop stung, blurred vision and left the eyes vulnerable to light. Prolonged use led to headaches, blindness, even death. But the effect dark pools gazing from a pale face was irresistible to fashion. Men wrote poetry about eyes that shimmered like midnight. They did not write about the migraines, the dizziness, or the creeping fear of permanent blindness. Each product carried immediate effects. Warnings your body whispered but society ignored. The burning sensation of ammonia on cheeks. The metallic taste of arsenic creeping into your mouth. The dizziness after swallowing wafers. The blurred vision of belladonna. These were dismissed as trifles. After all, beauty requires sacrifice, and the sacrifice of health was considered a fair price. Long-term consequences were harder to ignore. Women developed tremors, their hands shaking uncontrollably. Some lost hair, others teeth. Skin blistered, peeled, and scarred. Blindness crept slowly, unnoticed until it was too late. And yet the jars continued to sell. Social pressure was relentless. To appear less than perfect was to risk ridicule. To appear too natural was to be dismissed as coarse. Women endured, painted their faces each day with poisons that promised admiration, and carried their illnesses quietly, chalking them up to weakness or fate. The paradox was sharp. Society demanded purity, yet required poison. Men praised beauty, yet ignored the cost. Women smiled through pain, powdered trembling hands, and raised glassy eyes blurred by belladonna drops. Even fainting could be excused after all. Delicacy was fashionable, but the truth was harsher. Fainting was sometimes not from corsets, but from toxins seeping through bloodstreams. Behind closed doors, Some women rebelled quietly. They skipped the wafers, diluted the drops, and favored less toxic powders. They relied on natural remedies: rose water, oatmeal masks, herbal balms. But these efforts rarely earned the same admiration. Natural beauty was dismissed as insufficient, a mark of laziness or poverty. The riskier the method, the higher the social reward. Pain itself became proof of commitment. Think of the daily ritual. A woman wakes, pulls on her corset until her ribs ache, then sits at the vanity. She swallows an arsenic wafer, ignoring the nausea. She smooths ammonia cream across her cheeks, blinking against the sting. She dusts bismuth powder, coughing as particles fill the air. She tilts her head back, drops belladonna into her eyes, and blinks through the blur until her gaze looks suitably entrancing. She rises, every breath shallow, every nerve strained, every step toward the day a performance of fragility. The world sees beauty. She feels poison. And yet, despite the cruelty, there is resilience. Women laughed together at smudged powder, shared remedies for burns, exchanged whispered warnings about which products hurt the most. They found ways to endure, to reclaim fragments of control, even while trapped by expectations. They carried their suffering with humor, rolling their eyes at overzealous suitors who praised their delicate glow, knowing full well that glow was arsenic eating at their insides. The tragedy of Victorian cosmetics lies not only in the poison itself, but in the silence surrounding it. To complain was unladylike. To confess illness was weakness. And so women bore their scars quietly, their trembling hands hidden in gloves, their headaches dismissed as nerves, their fading eyesight cloaked in smiles. They became experts in endurance, beauty sculpted not from freedom but from suffering. The jars are empty now, their powders turned to dust, their poisons long discarded, but their legacy lingers. They remind us how far people will go when society demands perfection, how much harm can be normalized when beauty is tied to worth. And they whisper a warning that every age has its poisons, every society its dangerous ideals, and every generation its women who endure and resist. The true absurdity of Victorian beauty rituals becomes clearest when you picture the scale of effort behind them. Cosmetics were not purchased once and forgotten. They were daily, hourly, relentless. Dressing tables groaned under jars of powders, bottles of tinctures, and tiny envelopes of mysterious wafers. A middle-class woman might have arsenic wafers in one drawer, ammonia cream in another, belladonna drops carefully corked, and powders spread across the surface like battlefield weapons. Each morning was a campaign, the war against natural skin tone, against fatigue, against the inevitable truth of the human body. The smells alone would strike a modern nose as intolerable. Ammonia cream stung the nostrils, sharp enough to make eyes water before they ever touched the skin. Powders left a metallic tang in the air, so that an entire room smelled faintly of chalk and gunmetal. Belladonna drops reeked of crushed herbs and something darker, a bitterness clinging to the fingertips of whoever applied them. Even perfumes, meant to mask these odors, were often overpowering. Rose oil, violet water, lavender essence, all thick and cloying. Imagine standing in a crowded parlor, dozens of women powdered and perfumed, the air heavy with overlapping scents and the faint whiff of arsenic. It was less fragrance, more suffocation disguised as sophistication. The short-term consequences were felt almost immediately. Women complained of burning cheeks after applying ammonia, or dizziness that forced them to sit before finishing their toilette. Some developed red blotches under the white powder, a rash hidden beneath layers of cosmetics. Vision blurred after belladonna drops, turning candle flames into glowing halos, handsome suitors into smudges of color. And yet these discomforts were endured with stoic silence. To wince too obviously was to admit weakness. To complain was to risk being labeled hysterical. The long-term consequences were whispered in private but rarely admitted in public. Nervous tremors, physicians called them, when a woman's hands shook too violently to sew or play piano. Weak eyesight, when belladonna had damaged retinas beyond repair. Delicate constitution, when arsenic had quietly eroded strength and stamina. Euphemisms softened the truth, because society preferred to believe that beauty was harmless. even holy. To admit that cosmetics crippled women was to question the very system that exalted them. Some of the worst tragedies became cautionary tales, retold in hushed tones. A young bride who went blind before her third wedding anniversary, her eyes permanently ruined by drops. An actress whose once luminous skin grew sallow and scarred, her arsenic regimen finally consuming her vitality. A maid who experimented with her mistress's powders and collapsed, her body unable to bear the poison without the resilience of wealthier women's diets. These stories circulated, often exaggerated, but they did little to stem the tide. The pressure to appear flawless outweighed the fear of damage. The class divide sharpened the cruelty. Wealthier women could afford doctors, perfumed creams to soften side effects, and servants to apply treatments carefully. Poorer women copied what they could, often with homemade concoctions. Lead mixed with vinegar for whitening, soot for eyeliner, chalk scraped from walls for powder. These imitations were no safer, often worse, but they revealed how far the reach of beauty ideals extended. A peasant girl might not own belladonna, but she might still risk her health with vinegar washes or coal dust. The poison of expectation trickled down every rung of society. Even men were complicit, though rarely participants. They praised the effects, not the effort. Poems described luminous cheeks. Novels praised languid gazes. Gossip columns mocked women who appeared too ruddy or natural. The labor of cosmetics was invisible, its dangers ignored. A man might toast a woman's ethereal pallor at a ball, without realizing or caring that it came from a wafer, slowly corroding her insides. In this way, women carried the burden not only of fashion but of male fantasy. Their bodies, the canvas upon which cultural ideals were painted, no matter the cost. And still, there were sparks of rebellion. Some women chose simplicity, daring to appear with minimal powder, relying on soap and water rather than arsenic and ammonia. Others turned to natural remedies, rosewater, honey masks, oatmeal scrubs. These women often endured mockery, accused of being provincial, lazy, or unfashionable. But their resistance planted seeds that would blossom decades later in movements for rational dress and healthier standards of beauty. The persistence of these rituals reminds us how beauty is never merely about aesthetics. It is about power, control, and conformity. Each arsenic wafer swallowed was an act of compliance with a culture that equated worth with pallor. Each drop of belladonna was a silent submission to the idea that beauty mattered more than sight. Each powdered cheek was proof that women had learned to turn pain into performance. So when we look back at the jars and wafers, the bottles and powders, we see more than quaint relics. We see symbols of an age where beauty was crafted through poison, and where women endured with a mixture of humor, stoicism, and quiet despair. Theirs was not vanity, it was survival, carved onto skin and etched into bones. Imagine that you have survived the corset and the cosmetics. Your waist has been squeezed into a wasp's dream. Your skin has been bleached to a shade that makes marble look ruddy. And your pupils are so dilated from belladonna drops that you can barely distinguish your fiancé from the focus in the corner. But still, society demands more. The Victorian woman was not complete until her head became a stage, her hair a sculpture, and her hat an architectural marvel large enough to intimidate passing carriages. Let us start with the hair. The ideal was elaborate. Ringlets, curls, braids twisted into improbable designs, sometimes towering arrangements that suggested the hairdresser was more engineer than stylist. Achieving this grandeur required heat, metal, and endless patience. Enter the curling tongs, 2 iron rods heated in the fire until they glowed faintly red. They were applied directly to strands of hair, ideally to coax them into silky curls. In reality, they often singed the hair into brittle clumps, leaving a smell of scorched keratin drifting through the bedroom. Many women carried around hair that crackled faintly, the damage hidden beneath fresh curls and liberal applications of pomade. Burns to the scalp, forehead, or ears were common, accepted as the price of fashion, explained away as clumsy accidents. The danger did not stop at burns. Hair color was another battlefield, and Victorians were fearless in their willingness to coat their scalps with toxins. Blonde hair, considered angelic and desirable, could be approximated by rinsing with lead-based lighteners or silver nitrate solutions. Lead, unfortunately, does not care about fashion. It cares about entering the bloodstream, weakening bones, damaging kidneys, and slowly driving its host into exhaustion. Mercury was another option, giving a silvery sheen but at the cost of tremors, hallucinations, and premature death. Women wore their beauty like crowns of poison, smiling as their hands began to shake or their thoughts slipped into fog. And then came the wigs and hairpieces. Real human hair was in high demand, harvested from the heads of the poor and sold to the rich. Entire marketplaces thrived on hair, with brokers purchasing long braids from peasant girls for pennies, only to resell them for fortunes to fashionable ladies. Wigs were heavy, itchy, and difficult to clean. They attracted lice, which then spread into the natural hair beneath. Some women kept small combs at hand to discreetly scratch their scalps during social events, pretending to adjust a curl while quietly fighting an infestation. It was said that in some theaters, if you sat behind certain actresses, you might spot a tiny insect crawling across their elaborate coiffures, too bold to fear candlelight. But hair was only the beginning. Above it sat the crown of the Victorian ensemble, the hat. These were not modest bonnets or simple caps, but massive, decorated contraptions designed to announce wealth, taste, and social standing. Feathers were a must, often taken from exotic birds hunted to the brink of extinction. Some hats displayed entire taxidermied birds, wings outstretched as if the poor creature had died mid-flight and been preserved for decorative duty. The environmental toll was staggering. Species like the great egret and the bird of paradise suffered massive population declines because Victorian fashion declared their plumage irresistible. Hats were heavy, sometimes absurdly so. A woman's neck ached beneath the weight, her posture stiffened, and her balance wavered with every step. Securing these monstrosities required long, sharp pins, driven straight through the hat and into the piled hair beneath. The pins kept the hat from toppling, but they also turned every lady into a walking arsenal. Stories circulated of women accidentally stabbing themselves while adjusting their hats, or jabbing unsuspecting men who leaned too close. In crowded trams and theaters, hat pins became notorious for poking eyes, puncturing shoulders, and leaving scratches. Some jurisdictions even considered regulating their length, because they were effectively concealed weapons disguised as accessories. Now picture the total effect. A woman stands in full Victorian regalia. Her waist is cinched, her skin powdered, her eyes dilated. Her hair is a fragile tower, curls shellacked into position with oils and sprays, singed at the tips but gleaming in the gaslight. Upon it rests a hat the size of a small sailboat, pinned precariously to her scalp with spears of steel. She smiles, graceful and composed, though her head pounds from the strain and her neck muscles tremble from the effort. The audience sees elegance. She feels like a precarious puppet rigged for collapse. The dangers extended beyond physical harm to the environment around her. Those feathers and taxidermy ornaments were not mere fashion, they were status markers drenched in ecological cost. Entire industries thrived on the killing of exotic birds, their bodies reduced to hat trimmings. Conservation movements in the late 19th century were sparked in part by this slaughter, as naturalists and activists watched bird populations plummet. The Audubon Society was born as a protest against hats so deadly they might as well have been hunting trophies perched on a woman's head. Meanwhile, the physical strain of clothing multiplied the hazard. Skirts layered with petticoats added weight. Corsets limited oxygen intake. High collars constricted necks. Now add a hat heavy enough to double as a battering ram. Walking required concentration. Sitting demanded careful choreography, lest the hat tilt forward and block one's vision entirely. In windy weather, hats became liabilities. Women clutched them with gloved hands, praying the pins would hold. More than one fashionable lady was knocked flat by a gust, her dignity scattered along with her feathers. And yet, as with corsets and cosmetics, resistance was rare and often mocked. To appear bareheaded in public was scandalous. To neglect curls or color was to risk being called dowdy. Women endured burns, poisons, lice, and neck pain, not out of frivolity, but because society measured their worth through these very torment. Every curl was currency, every feather a proclamation, every pin a testament to discipline. The suffering was invisible, dismissed as the natural duty of womanhood. Think of the ritual at night. A maid unpins the hat carefully, withdrawing the long steel pins one by one. Each slides out with a soft hiss, like a weapon being sheathed. The hat, once removed, leaves the scalp throbbing. Hair pieces are tugged free, curls collapse, and the faint smell of scorched strands lingers in the air. The mirror reflects not the goddess of the ballroom, but a weary woman, her skin gray beneath powder, her scalp tender, her eyes watering from belladonna and fatigue. She is beautiful, yes, but she is also exhausted. And still, the cycle begins again in the morning. Curling irons reheated, powders reapplied, pins sharpened. Fashion was relentless, and to falter was to risk social exile. Husbands boasted of their wives' appearances, mothers prepared their daughters for the same ordeals, and society applauded from the sidelines. The laughter of parties and the gleam of theaters were built upon the silent suffering of women whose heads carried not just hats but the weight of expectation. It is tempting to laugh at the absurdity. Women skewering themselves with hatpins, burning their hair with tongs, balancing birds on their heads like bizarre trophies. But beneath the comedy is tragedy. Every burn scar, every tremor from mercury, every neck strained beneath the weight of fashion was a reminder that beauty was not freedom but servitude. These women were artists and prisoners, crafting elegance from pain, building grace from poison, living day after day in costumes that stole their health and demanded their silence. If hair was a battlefield and hats were monuments, then the daily maintenance of these symbols was a kind of unpaid war service. Think of the hours consumed. A middle-class lady might spend 2 to 3 hours each morning in front of her mirror, though of course, in front of the mirror is misleading, since much of the work was done by a servant with weary arms and singed fingers. Curling, arranging, pinning, oiling. Each action required precision, patience, and a tolerance for pain. For young girls, this ritual began shockingly early. Daughters were taught to sit still while their hair was tugged into order, sometimes from the age of 7 or 8. The smell of scorched strands became as familiar as porridge. Girls grew up associating discomfort with discipline, a lesson that carried straight into adulthood. Beauty was not pleasure, but endurance. Consider the maintenance of wigs and hairpieces. They were not static ornaments. They demanded care, brushing, and sometimes laundering. Human hair wigs could be washed in vinegar water, then re-oiled with a pomade that itself carried questionable ingredients, animal fat, perfumes, sometimes even lead-based additives to keep the hair shiny. Wigs not cleaned properly developed odors, the kind that clung to a person's clothing and betrayed their behind-the-scenes neglect. Women who could not afford proper maintenance sometimes resorted to sprinkling wigs with powders or dousing them in cologne, creating a strange cocktail of smells: grease, musk, roses, and faint rot. The hat industry itself grew into an empire. Milliners were not merely artisans. They were trendsetters, arbiters of taste, and, unknowingly, participants in ecological destruction. Entire trades revolved around sourcing exotic feathers and skins, with colonial expansion feeding the demand. Ships carried crates of bird skins from the Caribbean, India, and the Pacific Islands, destined for London workshops. Fashion pages in magazines displayed sketches of the latest hat styles, each more flamboyant than the last, as though women's heads were competing to host the most extravagant aviary. And those infamous hatpins, sharp, long, gleaming, deserved their own saga. They were practical, yes, but they also became cultural flashpoints. Newspapers reported accidents: a gentleman leaning in too closely at the opera, only to emerge with a bloody scratch across his cheek; a woman boarding a crowded tram, her pin accidentally spearing the hat of the man behind her. These were written about with a mixture of horror and amusement, but the danger was real. There were even recorded cases of women using hatpins deliberately as self-defense against street harassers, stabbing at groping hands with the same weapon meant to hold fashion in place. In this way, the hatpin became both a hazard and a rare tool of empowerment, though one society never acknowledged as such. The sheer weight of clothing and accessories compounded every discomfort. Imagine standing in a summer garden party in full attire, corset compressing your lungs, multiple petticoats insulating you like a portable oven, gloves trapping sweat against your palms, hair piled high and heated by the sun. and then a hat weighing several pounds balanced precariously above it all. The body sagged, the skin itched, but the face maintained composure. A woman was expected to smile sweetly, even while her scalp screamed and her neck throbbed. Satirical magazines of the time picked up on this absurdity. Caricatures showed women toppling under the weight of their hats, or fainting not from passion but from the cumulative burden of curls, pins, and plumes. Yet, satire never dented the actual practice. If anything, it reinforced the notion that fashion was a public spectacle, a performance that invited commentary, laughter, and judgment. One cannot ignore the ripple effect on servants either. The maids who curled hair, cleaned wigs, pinned hats, and retrieved feathers bore their own risks. Fingers blistered from hot irons, hands raw from chemicals, eyes watering from powders. The work was invisible labor, doubly hidden. First beneath the glamour of their mistress's final appearance, and second behind the curtain of class expectations that rendered servant suffering irrelevant. And what of men's reactions? Men claimed to admire the results, but many also ridiculed the process. They marveled at elaborate curls without acknowledging the burns, admired the sweep of feathers without seeing the trembling neck beneath. In diaries and letters, some mocked women's fashions as excessive, forgetting that their approval or disapproval was what drove the cycle in the first place. Women dressed for society, which was shaped overwhelmingly by male-defined ideals. The irony was bitter. Men both demanded and mocked the very standards they imposed. The hazards were not always immediate. Lead dyes accumulated slowly. Mercury poisoned the nervous system over years. Neck strain from heavy hats led to chronic pain that might be dismissed as female weakness. These long-term consequences became part of the background hum of Victorian life, accepted like the smoke of factories or the stench of city streets. Unpleasant, harmful, but normalized. And yet, within this web of expectation, women adapted with resilience and creativity. Some learned to pin hats more lightly, to curl hair with less heat, to choose feathers from local birds rather than exotic imports. Others quietly resisted, appearing in simpler styles when they could afford the social risk. There were moments of solidarity too, women laughing together as a hat slid sideways, sharing tips on hiding burns, or joking about hat pins as secret daggers. Humor became survival, a small rebellion woven into the larger fabric of endurance. In the end, the Victorian head was not just a site of fashion but a microcosm of the era's contradictions. Ingenuity paired with recklessness, elegance, masking, suffering, beauty perched precariously on the edge of absurdity. Hair and hats symbolized not just personal style, but a society willing to sacrifice health, comfort, and even ecosystems for the fleeting shimmer of status. The legacy endures in photographs and caricatures. Women staring solemnly from sepia portraits, their heads crowned with impossible structures, their eyes betraying little of the weight they carried. In Victorian society, the angel of the house ideal wasn't just a pretty phrase, it was a job description. Women were expected to be the beating heart of the household, nurturing, organized, efficient, and, above all, flawlessly poised. The ideal woman was a combination of saint and servant, expected to maintain a picture-perfect home while making it all look effortless. Beneath the layers of lace, curls, and corsets, however, lay a weight so heavy it threatened to crush even the most poised. The angel of the house wasn't supposed to be just a woman who kept the home clean. She was the architect of domestic bliss, the unseen force that ran the entire household without a flicker of visible effort. Everything had to be perfect. The fire had to be lit at the right time, the tea steeped at exactly the right moment, the children fed and entertained with as little mess as possible. The floors had to shine, the linens ironed to perfection, and the silver polished until it gleamed. It wasn't just about keeping the house running, it was about keeping up appearances. Behind this domestic facade, however, was an exhausting amount of invisible labor. The daily work wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional, and, above all, invisible. Supervising servants, planning meals, and maintaining the appearance of the home took far more than just cleaning. A woman's role in the household meant ensuring that everything appeared seamless. She had to be ever present and always in control, regardless of her own exhaustion. Picture the scene. The woman of the house is up before dawn, corset laced tight, head half covered in the pretense of being well rested. She arranges breakfast for the family, sets the table, makes sure the children are dressed, but not too fancy, don't want them to look like little adults after all, and supervises the maidservant as she scrubs the floors. The house, though modest, must appear immaculate to visitors after all. Appearance was everything. Visitors might drop by unexpectedly, and a messy house could ruin reputations in an instant. This constant surveillance of cleanliness, order, and harmony was not only physically draining, it also created a mental burden too heavy to measure in pounds. But it wasn't just about physical labor. A Victorian woman's days were also filled with mental gymnastics, managing crises with grace, maintaining appearances at all costs, and ensuring that the social calendar ran smoothly. Dinner parties, teas, luncheons, and charity events were all part of the social obligations expected of every respectable woman. It wasn't just about inviting guests, it was about making them feel welcomed, respected, and pampered, while remaining poised enough to appear untouched by the chaos of the daily grind. There was little room for personal desires or fatigue. A Victorian woman's emotions were meant to be hidden behind a facade of grace. This was where the concept of the angel of the house became both a blessing and a curse. The woman was expected to sacrifice herself, to remain endlessly patient, endlessly nurturing, and endlessly cheerful, regardless of how drained she felt. The mental strain was compounded by the fact that she couldn't show weakness. If a woman were to admit she was overwhelmed or tired, she was often labeled as unfit for her role. The ideal was unattainable, but this didn't stop society from demanding it. The constant tension between societal expectations and physical reality led to chronic stress, anxiety, and often severe depression. The mind and body of the Victorian woman were in constant conflict as she strove to meet expectations that were, frankly, impossible. Consider the role of the servant for a moment. It wasn't enough for a woman to oversee household duties. She had to manage servants, ensure their work was up to standard, and deal with the politics of her domestic staff. The maid had to be disciplined, but not too harshly. The cook efficient, but not too bold. The laundress polite, but always available. A woman was responsible for ensuring this small army of workers ran like a well-oiled machine, but she could never be too direct with them. She had to be an authority figure, while maintaining the appearance of kindness and gentle instruction. In addition to this invisible labor, there was the emotional burden. A woman's emotional state was always under scrutiny. She was expected to be the emotional anchor of the household, to smile even when weary, to offer comfort even when in pain. In public, the woman was to be unflappable, a source of calm and reassurance. Behind closed doors, she could not express frustration or sorrow openly without risk of being labeled as hysterical or unstable. Every emotion had to be filtered through the lens of propriety. Crying was allowed only in extreme circumstances. To show fatigue was to show weakness. The demands on a Victorian woman's mental and emotional health were relentless. Social obligations never stopped coming, and with each dinner party or charitable function, the pressure grew. Maintaining appearances wasn't just a matter of pride, it was a matter of survival. If a woman failed to host the right dinner party or attend the right event, she risked being ostracized or judged. The ideal angel of the house had to maintain this balance between home life and social life, all while never allowing her physical or mental state to slip into view. When a woman fainted, often due to a combination of exhaustion, tight corsets, and poor air quality, her fainting was seen as a demonstration of delicacy and refinement, not a result of physical distress. To collapse was romanticized. To endure was expected. The burden of balancing all of this was not just physical, it was psychological. A woman had to be aware at all times of the way she presented herself. Not just her appearance, but her demeanor, her speech, and her actions. Everything had to reflect the perfection of her domestic management. The irony, of course, was that this perfection was unattainable. Women lived under the constant threat of failure, never knowing whether they had done enough, whether they had performed enough, or whether their lives could ever measure up to the standard society had set. This burden didn't just affect the individual woman, it affected the entire family. Children were raised in an atmosphere of constant evaluation, where their behavior was often determined by how well their mother could manage the house. A woman's worth was determined not just by the cleanliness of her home, but by the success of her family's social appearances. Picture the scene. A Victorian woman hosting a dinner party. She must greet every guest with a pleasant smile, serve each course with the grace of a ballet dancer, and manage conversation with the subtlety of a diplomat. All the while, her corset digs into her ribs, her stomach growls, and her legs ache from standing for hours. But none of this is shown. Every movement, every word, every smile is carefully calculated, designed to project an image of perfection. The house is spotless, the food is excellent, the guests are happy, and yet she feels the weight of it all pressing down on her. She is the epitome of elegance and grace on the outside, but beneath the surface, she is barely holding it together. In the end, the life of a Victorian woman was a paradox, both angelic and burdensome, beautiful and painful. The expectation to maintain perfection at all costs was both a privilege and a prison. And though many women complied, some, quietly and subtly, fought back, choosing comfort over beauty, autonomy over duty, and, ultimately, the right to live without such relentless, suffocating expectations. Behind the lace curtains, under the weight of silk gowns and layers of undergarments, a Victorian woman's day was far more than just a series of tasks. It was a balancing act of appearances. Every corner of her home needed to be perfectly maintained, not just clean, but polished, organized in such a way that every visitor could immediately grasp her success. Guests would glance around the room, making swift assessments. The arrangement of chairs, the sparkle of the silverware, the tidiness of the hearth. They saw perfection. They did not see the sweat of the woman who had spent hours making sure everything was just so. It was a life governed by unwritten rules. A woman could not simply rest. If she were not actively attending to the needs of her home, she was failing. Time spent reading, writing, or simply sitting idle was viewed as laziness. In public, the demands were equally harsh. Women were expected to host flawless dinners and teas. A dinner party was not merely an occasion to eat. It was an opportunity to demonstrate wealth, taste, and superior management skills. From the moment the guests arrived to the moment they departed, every interaction was scrutinized. Was the conversation engaging? Was the tea brewed at just the right temperature? Were the guests served promptly and courteously? No detail was too small. The food must arrive on time. The wine must be poured at the proper moment. And the guests must be made to feel like the most important people in the room. In the midst of all of this, the hostess herself was expected to remain effortlessly elegant, her hair perfectly styled, her posture impeccable, her speech kind but firm. She was not to be seen to be managing the work. Her role was to be graceful, composed, and unaffected by the strain of it all. No matter how tired she was, no matter how much pain she endured from the tight grip of her corset, she had to be a paragon of poise and beauty. There was also the matter of appearance in public. A woman's reputation hinged not just on how she presented her home, but on how she presented herself. The pressure to appear perfect was relentless. This wasn't about vanity, it was about survival. A woman who was seen as disorganized, unkempt, or lacking grace could lose her standing in the social hierarchy, or worse, be deemed unfit for marriage or other societal roles. But these ideals, as impossible as they were, came with emotional costs. The very act of managing a household and upholding these standards led to the development of deep anxiety. Imagine feeling the weight of your home, your family's reputation, and the expectations of everyone who stepped across your threshold. Each slight mistake could cost you an improperly tied bow, a small stain on the tablecloth, a poorly timed conversation. All could lead to judgment, not just of your abilities, but of your worth as a woman. It was not only about being a good cook or an excellent hostess. It was about being a good person worthy of respect, admiration, and even love. To falter in these duties was to falter in your very humanity. The constant vigilance wore down the psyche. Anxiety became a regular companion, gnawing at the mind in the moments of supposed rest. Should you have said something else to that guest? Was your dress as neat as it could have been? Did your husband seem irritated? A single look from him could send ripples of doubt through a woman's mind. The idea that you could ever escape the social gaze, whether in public or private, was a distant fantasy. Even more oppressive than these expectations were the ever-present worries about social reputation. What others thought was more important than what you felt. It didn't matter if the woman of the house was exhausted, physically aching, or emotionally drained. She had to appear radiant, composed, and happy. Smiling through exhaustion was the ultimate test of Victorian womanhood. The reward was not just social respect, but a sense of worth. If a woman could keep up this act day after day, she earned not just admiration, but a place in the social order. But behind closed doors, women often whispered about the toll it took on their health, their minds, and their bodies. The mental burden wasn't simply internal. It was embedded in the expectations placed on every woman by society. No one ever told a woman she had permission to not be perfect. And so, women operated in an environment where failure was not an option. If they couldn't measure up, they feared being viewed as inferior. Inferior to other women, to men, to society as a whole. They were held to impossible standards, some of which were clearly beyond their ability to control. Even if a woman managed to live up to the ideal in terms of appearances, the emotional cost was devastating. She had to maintain grace while juggling responsibilities. While she was responsible for the well-being of everyone in her home, no one asked her how she felt. There was no space in the Victorian system for self-care, for personal time. Women had to appear to be constantly thriving, constantly managing, constantly giving without taking. They were, in essence, everything to everyone. This kind of burden is slowly carved away at a woman's sense of self. Anxiety, depression, and mental strain were not just unspoken, they were unacknowledged entirely. Women were taught to ignore their mental well-being and focus instead on what they could do for others. They were defined by their ability to serve, to manage, to remain poised under the weight of everything. Perhaps most tragic of all, these standards were passed down to the next generation. Young girls were not only taught to be beautiful, but to become the ideal, to prepare themselves for the same emotional, physical, and mental sacrifices. From a young age, they were shown how to take care of the home, how to behave in front of guests, how to speak and act with poise and grace. They were also taught how to deal with disappointment, how to suppress their emotions, how to mask discomfort, how to never show weakness. This cycle of expectations repeated itself, century after century. Women were told that this was the only way to be good, proper, or worthy. The sense of guilt, pressure, and sacrifice was passed from mother to daughter, from one generation to the next. But there were small rebellions. Women found ways to fight back, even if only in subtle ways. They might let their corsets out just a little, so they could breathe more easily. They might resist some social engagements, not for lack of duty, but because they simply couldn't face one more event. Others sought refuge in private spaces, silent corners of the house, where they could rest or write without the pressure of social expectation. And then, in time, there were more open forms of resistance. The suffrage movement gained momentum, and women began to demand a place at the table literally and figuratively. They rejected the idea that their only purpose was to serve others, to look good, to keep their homes perfect. They spoke out about the physical and mental toll that centuries of expectations had exacted from them. It was in these small victories, these tiny rebellions, that a slow, steady transformation began to take place. Imagine, if you will, a grand Victorian ballroom, filled with the soft hum of conversation, the rustle of satin skirts, and the clink of crystal glasses. Women, adorned in their finest gowns, lace chins held high, and the weight of their corsets pressing them into an uncomfortable but necessary poise, glide through the room. The men, oblivious to the bodily discomforts of their female counterparts, praised their elegance, commenting on the tightness of waists, the delicate beauty of the women before them. But in the corner, away from the polished floors and soft candlelight, a woman falters. Her breath comes in short, shallow gasps. Her skin pale as a ghost, eyes glazing over. Her corset is too tight, her lungs too compressed, and the effort of standing so perfectly for so long is too much. She falls. A fainting spell. A sight as common as it is tragic, accepted as part of the charm. even a sign of a delicate constitution. But beneath the glamour of the ball, beneath the corsetry and the gilded chandeliers, is the grim truth of Victorian beauty standards. The women weren't fainting from sheer romanticism. They were fainting because the very way they were expected to exist was choking them. In fact, fainting was so normalized in the Victorian era that it almost became an expected social performance. A woman fainting at a ball, or even during a formal dinner, wasn't always a cause for immediate concern. It was almost an accepted part of the spectacle of femininity. A well-placed swoon was a statement of fragility, an expression of delicate virtue. But in reality, it was more than just a theatrical display. It was the result of physical collapse. The restriction of corsetry, combined with the stress of social obligations, left women vulnerable to fainting spells. In one of the most common situations, the victim of such a fainting spell would be rushed to the nearest fainting couch or chair, where a servant would apply smelling salts and an attentive audience would wait for the woman to recover, offering tea or water to revive her. What is more troubling, however, is the casual acceptance of this suffering. Fainting, dizziness, difficulty breathing, these were symptoms of an underlying problem that no one truly addressed. Women were told they were delicate, that this was simply part of being female. Society not only allowed, but encouraged women to endure these physical limitations in pursuit of beauty. A corset was not just a piece of clothing. It was a tool of cultural conformity. It represented both a personal and societal sacrifice, demanding that women make themselves smaller in every possible way, from their waists to their lungs, just to fit the mold of what was considered beautiful. In fact, the harm caused by these fashion choices went far beyond the occasional fainting spell. The long-term consequences were much more severe and far-reaching. Doctors of the era noted various health conditions that directly stemmed from tight corsets: irregular menstruation, organ displacement, respiratory problems, digestive issues, and skeletal deformation. The corset had a profound impact on a woman's internal organs. Over time, it could push the stomach upwards, compressing the lungs and making it difficult for women to breathe properly. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. But the issue was not just physical. The constant pressure to meet society's beauty standards led to a psychological toll that was just as damaging. A woman's worth was tied to her appearance, her waist size, her posture, the smoothness of her skin. The corset, along with other beauty routines, reinforced this standard by physically reminding women that they were nothing more than bodies to be shaped, displayed, and admired. Yet, there were no easy solutions. Women were trapped between societal expectations and their own health, forced to choose between conformity and self-preservation. Even when a woman experienced discomfort or health issues as a result of her corset, she had little room to discuss it. She could not speak up in public without risking ridicule. It was understood that beauty came at a price sometimes. That price was health, but it was a price that most women felt they had to pay. But this pressure was not confined to just one generation. The normalization of this suffering trickled down to young girls, who were taught that beauty came from submission to fashion, to societal norms, and to their own discomfort. Parents, especially mothers, who had suffered from the same burdens, would often begin corseting their daughters at an early age, creating a cycle of pain and sacrifice that would continue through generations. Girls as young as 12 were laced into corsets, their bodies molded into the shape of an idealized womanhood that they would spend the rest of their lives trying to maintain. Young girls learned early how to hold their breath, how to suppress the urge to sit comfortably, how to bend and move with the rigid grace of the corset. The consequences of these early years of restriction were deeply ingrained, affecting not only the body but the mind as well. Young girls grew up learning that their bodies were not their own, but something that must be controlled, bent, and shaped into society's image of the perfect woman. In response to these impossible standards, small acts of rebellion began to emerge, although they were often subtle and covert. Some women began to loosen their corsets slightly, not enough to risk their social reputation, but enough to allow for a deeper breath. Others would forgo the most extreme beauty treatments, choosing instead to rely on natural remedies, or skipping the arsenic wafers in favor of safer methods of complexion care. These acts of defiance were small, personal victories, moments when women could take back a measure of control over their own bodies. There were also quiet resistances taking place in fashion itself. Over time, some women began experimenting with less restrictive clothing, pushing against the confines of the corset and the rigid, suffocating layers that were so typical of the time. The Rational Dress Society, which emerged in the 1852, was one of the first organized efforts to advocate for more comfortable and less restrictive clothing for women. The society promoted the idea that clothing should be practical, not torturous, and that women should be allowed the freedom to move, breathe, and live without being encased in tight, painful garments. Though the Rational Dress Society was largely dismissed in its time as a radical movement, it planted the seeds for future change. But even with these early steps toward reform, the damage was already done. The ideal of the tiny waist, of the hourglass figure, was so ingrained in Victorian society that even the smallest attempts to break free from it were met with resistance and ridicule. And yet, this resistance was crucial. It was a slow, quiet revolution that eventually gave way to the more practical, comfortable clothing we take for granted today. In the end, the story of the corset and the physical harm it caused is not just one of suffering. It is a story of survival, of women who endured incredible physical and emotional hardship for the sake of beauty and societal acceptance. It is a story of how women adapted, resisted, and fought for agency over their own bodies. The damage caused by these extreme beauty standards lingers in the historical memory of women's bodies, but it also serves as a reminder of how far we have come and how far we still have to go. Fainting was, in its way, the most socially acceptable form of collapse a Victorian woman could experience. For society, it was a sign of fragility, of delicate sensibilities, and it was often met with murmurs of admiration rather than concern. After all, fainting had become almost a cultural performance, a part of a woman's toolkit for navigating the rigid expectations placed upon her. The fainting couch was not just a piece of furniture, it was a necessary item in every well-kept Victorian home, strategically placed in parlors, waiting rooms, and dining rooms. It was the ultimate accessory for those moments when, overwhelmed by corsets and social obligations, a woman simply could not carry on. But fainting was not merely a spectacle. It was a consequence of the harsh, constricting conditions that Victorian women endured daily. Women were often praised for their delicate constitution, as if their bodies were fragile porcelain, a thing of beauty to be admired from a distance but not touched. The corset, tight and suffocating, contributed to this idea of frailty. It didn't just shape the body, it trapped it, reducing a woman to little more than a breathing mannequin designed for display. The fainting spells, however, were not just the result of corsetry alone. They were part of a broader culture that normalized physical suffering. Women were expected to endure not only physical discomfort but mental exhaustion as well. From the constant pressure to meet beauty standards to the emotional labor required to maintain social propriety, the weight of these expectations was unbearable for many. Medical professionals were well aware of the toll these expectations took on women's health. Some of the most common diagnoses included chronic headaches, dizziness, and nervous disorders, symptoms that were often linked to the stress caused by wearing tight corsets for extended periods. Women who wore corsets every day suffered from irregular menstruation, digestive problems, and even dislocated ribs. But these medical conditions were rarely discussed openly. The narrative was clear. The ideal woman was one who sacrificed her comfort, her health, and her well-being for the sake of beauty. The doctor's diagnosis was often dismissed as mere inconvenience or worse, as a woman's weakness. Fainting, for example, was almost romanticized, seen as an unfortunate but graceful reaction to the extreme physical strain caused by corsets. When a woman collapsed at a social gathering, it was seen as a tragic, yet beautiful display of femininity. Women who suffered from fainting spells were often treated with sympathy, though this sympathy was more about maintaining the illusion of delicate beauty than about genuine concern for their health. It was a cycle of suffering that was normalized. Women were expected to faint, to be fragile, and in return, they were deemed beautiful. But this fragile beauty came at a price. Over time, the constant pressure of corsetry led to irreversible damage to women's bodies. The medical consequences were not immediately visible, but accumulated over years of wear. Organs were shifted out of place, Ribs became misaligned, and bones weakened. Many women, despite the apparent perfection of their appearance, were quietly suffering from chronic pain. But this suffering was ignored, even romanticized, as a necessary cost of beauty. The danger was not just physical. It was emotional and psychological as well. Women were taught to suppress their discomfort, to endure the pain of their corsets, the sting of cosmetics, and the suffocating expectations of their society. To complain about these burdens was seen as unseemly, unladylike. It was a woman's duty to endure without ever letting on that she was struggling. This silence became a form of self-policing. Women were not only expected to conform to societal standards, they were expected to do so without protest. As a result, many women became masters of disguise, hiding their pain behind smiles and social graces. They learned to faint with dignity, to endure the discomfort of tight corsets with stoic expressions, to carry the weight of societal expectations without ever showing the strain. The emotional toll of this constant performance was immense. Women were not only trapped by their clothing, but by their own minds, forever questioning their worth based on the standards set by others. But it wasn't just fainting that indicated the harm of corsetry. Over time, women began to experience other health issues that were tied directly to their restrictive clothing. Chronic back pain was common, as the corset forced the body into an unnatural position for hours on end. Breathing became shallow and difficult, and many women reported dizziness and fainting after extended periods of wearing the corset. For some women, the health consequences of tight corsets were far more severe. There were reports of women suffering from organ displacement, which could lead to gastrointestinal problems, bladder issues, and even permanent damage to the reproductive system. Doctors knew that prolonged pressure on the abdomen could cause internal organs to shift out of place, leading to a host of long-term health issues. But again, these problems were rarely discussed openly. Women endured the physical pain in silence, never questioning the corset or the beauty standards it embodied. And then there was the issue of mental health. The constant pressure to meet impossible standards of beauty and behavior took a heavy toll on women's mental well-being. The fear of judgment, the constant anxiety about appearance, and the pressure to maintain perfection led many women to suffer from depression, anxiety, and even suicidal thoughts. The expectations placed on women were so intense, so constant, that it often felt impossible to escape. As for the younger generation, the damage began early. From an early age, girls were taught to conform to these restrictive beauty standards. Corsets were introduced before puberty, often at the age of 12 or 13. Young girls were taught to endure discomfort and pain, to shrink their waists, to adhere to a model of beauty that was both physically harmful and emotionally oppressive. They learned from their mothers and older sisters that beauty was about sacrifice, about suffering in silence. These girls, growing up with the legacy of corsetry, began to internalize the idea that their bodies were not their own. They were not allowed to be comfortable. They were not allowed to breathe fully. They were taught that beauty and perfection were worth any price, including their health. The emotional and physical damage done by these beauty standards was passed down through generations, creating a cycle of harm that was difficult to break. However, there were small acts of rebellion, subtle but significant. Some women, especially in later years, began to loosen their corsets slightly, finding ways to relieve the pressure. Others sought out healthier alternatives, such as looser, more breathable fabrics or corsets designed to be less restrictive. But these changes were slow, and they were not universally accepted. The pressure to conform remained strong, and the idea that a woman's value was tied to her appearance persisted. Despite this, the subtle rebellions grew. Over time, the rational dress society emerged, advocating for looser, more comfortable clothing for women. Some women abandoned the corset altogether, seeking freedom in less restrictive styles. These small victories, while often derided at the time, laid the foundation for the eventual rejection of corsets and the rise of more practical, comfortable fashion in the 20th century. For centuries, women endured the confines of the corset as a sign of beauty, virtue, and respectability. Their waists were constricted, their lungs compressed, their bodies reshaped to meet an ideal. But by the mid-19th century, there were whispers. Small murmurs of discomfort began to rise from beneath the weight of steel and fabric, from under the suffocating laces of the corset. A new idea was taking root. What if comfort could be compatible with fashion? What if women could breathe, move, and even, dare we say it, live without sacrificing their beauty? Enter the Rational Dress Society, a movement born from the very dissatisfaction that corsetry created. The Rational Dress Society's mission was simple but revolutionary: to promote breathable, comfortable clothing for women that would allow them to live without fear of fainting, physical deformities, or lifelong health issues. Their goal was to encourage women to reject the torturous and dangerous garments of the past in favor of more practical and breathable alternatives. It was a bold and radical proposition. To think that fashion could ever exist without a corset or without the restrictive undergarments that defined femininity for centuries seemed unthinkable. But the Rational Dress Society saw the physical toll that restrictive clothing was taking on women. The pressure to achieve the tiny waist, the constriction that stifled movement, the exhaustion that came from hours of breathlessness. It was not just painful, it was harmful. The Society's solution was to offer women a way to embrace their health without sacrificing their appearance. The concept was radical: clothing that worked with the body, not against it. One of the Society's earliest and most visible efforts was the push for breathable corsets, garments that would still provide support, but without the extreme compression. These new corsets featured lighter fabrics, less bone, and most importantly, more flexibility. The idea was that women could achieve the desired silhouette without enduring the immense physical strain that came with traditional corsets. Of course, these new corsets were met with resistance. Many women, even those who supported the movement, still clung to their tight-laced tradition. The fear of losing one's place in society was strong after all. A woman's waistline was not just an aesthetic choice. It was a symbol of her worth, her social standing, and even her moral character. To abandon the corset was not just an act of rebellion, it was an act of risk. But the Rational Dress Society's ideas didn't stop at corsets. They advocated for divided skirts, which would give women more freedom of movement and comfort without compromising their social respectability. Divided skirts were essentially the Victorian equivalent of modern-day trousers split at the center. They offered more mobility and breathability while still being socially acceptable for women. The idea was controversial, though many saw divided skirts as unfeminine and improper, likening them to the masculine attire of men. Yet, for the women who adopted them, they were a revolutionary step forward, allowing them to walk, cycle, and participate in daily activities without suffering in silence. Speaking of cycling, the era also saw the introduction of the bicycle as a popular pastime for women. Cycling offered women an opportunity for independence, exercise, and even a taste of freedom. However, cycling in Victorian times was not without its own set of fashion hazards. Traditional dresses were impractical for cycling. Long skirts, petticoats, and restrictive corsets made movement awkward and uncomfortable. The Rational Dress Society advocated for cycling attire, which included more functional skirts, often shortened, bloomers, and less restrictive clothing. These outfits were designed to allow women to ride bicycles without the cumbersome restrictions of traditional Victorian fashion. Imagine the scene: a woman, liberated from her corset, pedaling freely on a bicycle, the wind in her hair, the sun on her face, and the freedom of movement she had never known before. It was an empowering image, one that clashed sharply with the image of the dainty, delicate woman bound by laces and layers. Cycling attire wasn't just about comfort, it was about reclaiming autonomy, about taking control over one's own body and the way it was dressed. Yet, as revolutionary as cycling attire was, it still faced stiff opposition. The idea that women could ride bicycles, let alone wear clothing designed for movement, was seen as scandalous by many. But despite the resistance, small victories began to accumulate as more women adopted rational dress for cycling, for daily life, and for more practical activities. Society began to take notice. These women, though criticized, were paving the way for more freedom in fashion. The Rational Dress Society, with their advocacy for comfortable clothing, managed to start a slow and steady conversation about women's rights to their own bodies. Their movement didn't end with a single victory. Rather, it built on incremental change. They slowly began to dismantle the societal structures that had bound women in uncomfortable, life-threatening clothing. These early victories also had social implications. The very notion of health in fashion became a powerful argument. Women who wore these new, more comfortable garments often experienced fewer fainting spells, less back pain, and fewer health problems overall. The immediate physical relief was palpable, but so was the emotional liberation that came with it. Women began to see themselves not as fragile creatures confined to couches or corsets, but as active participants in their own lives. They could walk without waddling, bend without contorting, laugh without gasping for air. Moreover, the growing acceptance of more comfortable clothing and rational dress shifted societal views. Slowly but surely, women began to demand more from their clothing. They refused to let their health and well-being be sacrificed on the altar of beauty. Through small acts of defiance, looser corsets, shorter skirts, and more breathable fabrics, women took control of their own bodies, asserting their right to comfort and mobility. They rejected the idea that beauty had to be pain, that femininity was defined by constriction, that fashion was about submission. The formation of supportive networks among women further catalyzed this change. Women began to share their experiences, discuss what worked for them, and offer advice to others who wanted to join the movement. This sense of solidarity was vital. It was not just about individual change. It was about a collective effort to make fashion safer and healthier for all women. These networks laid the groundwork for future movements that would continue to challenge the rigid standards of beauty and fashion imposed on women. But as with all movements, change came slowly. The road to true comfort and freedom in fashion was long, and the opposition remained fierce. Critics of the Rational Dress Society claimed that such clothing would ruin women's femininity, robbing them of their delicacy and grace. To some, the shift in fashion signaled the beginning of the end of traditional femininity. But those who championed rational dress understood something important. The essence of femininity is not found in the restriction of the body, but in its freedom to move, breathe, and live. And so, these early victories, though small in the grand scheme of history, represented an important shift. They showed that even in an age where beauty and fashion were inextricably tied to suffering, change was possible. Women were no longer merely subjects of fashion. They were becoming the authors of their own stories. Through the Rational Dress Society, cycling attire, and other smaller victories, women slowly but surely reclaimed ownership over their bodies, their clothes, and their lives. What the Rational Dress Society helped to initiate was a broader movement toward greater autonomy, not just in clothing but in all aspects of women's lives. It wasn't simply about freeing women from corsets, it was about freeing them from the mental and social shackles that held them back from achieving their fullest potential. And although the movement itself was slow to gain widespread acceptance, it laid the foundation for later, more far-reaching societal changes that would ultimately allow women to choose their clothing and their lives without compromise. The Rational Dress Society, though controversial at its inception, was more than just a fashion trend. It represented a quiet rebellion, a breaking of chains woven into the very fabric of Victorian womanhood. The corset, once a symbol of control and beauty, began to be seen for what it truly was, a tool of oppression. Yet its removal was not an easy process. Fashion was not only about appearance, it was about survival in a social world that equated physical restriction with respectability. The Rational Dress Society's message was simple but radical. Women deserve clothing that works with their bodies, not against them. The idea of wearing clothes that allowed for comfort and movement was revolutionary in an age when the very definition of femininity was tied to stiffness, to tight lacing, to impracticality. While men, even those of lower classes, had clothes that allowed them to move freely and comfortably, women were still expected to endure endless discomfort in the name of beauty. The society began advocating for breathable corsets, those made of lighter fabrics, and a reduction in the amount of boning that would crush the body into a tiny shape. The goal was still to emphasize the waistline, but without sacrificing the wearer's ability to breathe, move, or live without constant pain. The society's first visible success came with divided skirts. At the time, women's fashion was notoriously restrictive. Petticoats were heavy, layers of fabric that made even walking an arduous task. The Rational Dress Society advocated for skirts that were divided, like pants, allowing women to move freely. While the sight of women in pants or divided skirts was scandalous to many, others began to realize that the benefits far outweighed the social consequences. For women living in rural areas, these divided skirts allowed for practical movement, whether on horseback, in the fields, or at the market. In cities, these garments allowed women to step away from the stifling confines of traditional fashion and reclaim their mobility. Though the divided skirt was far from mainstream, it began to spread, especially among women who enjoyed cycling, a newfound activity that was revolutionizing women's leisure time. The bicycle, as much a tool of empowerment as it was of freedom, was fundamentally incompatible with the restrictive clothing of the time. Women needed practical, comfortable clothing to ride, which meant abandoning the corset and choosing more flexible, breathable options. Cycling attire began to be designed with women in mind, including tailored pants, looser skirts, and lighter, easier-to-manage corsets that allowed women to move freely. These outfits marked a significant departure from the norm, and were seen as a stepping stone toward the gradual liberation of women's bodies from the chains of fashion. But these changes were not instantaneous. The Rational Dress Society was often mocked by the press and ridiculed for its unfeminine ideas. The idea that women could wear practical, functional clothing that allowed them to move freely, was seen as a threat to the established social order. To wear practical clothing was to reject the ideal of the delicate, fragile woman, the woman whose beauty and worth were tied directly to her ability to endure suffering. The criticism was harsh, yet the message of the society found its way into the hearts and minds of many women. One of the early victories of the rational dress movement was the creation of health corsets. These corsets were designed to support the body without the extreme compression of traditional corsetry. They were made from lighter fabrics, often reinforced with steel or plastic instead of the heavy whalebone, and allowed the woman wearing them to stand and sit without suffocating. Though still restrictive by modern standards, these corsets were a monumental improvement for women who had been wearing their traditional corsets for decades. Health corsets were often sold with promises of comfort and improvement, yet they were far from perfect. The real breakthrough came when women began to demand more than just physical comfort. They began to demand autonomy over their own bodies. As the 19th century wore on, the idea of freedom in clothing became intertwined with the larger women's rights movement. Women began to question why they should be expected to suffer for beauty. Why should their bodies be distorted for the pleasure of society? Why should they be uncomfortable simply to appear respectable? It was this mindset that led to cycling attire becoming more than just a fad. It became a symbol of empowerment. Women who had once been restricted to sitting at home, looking delicate and waiting for a suitor, now had the ability to move freely, to exercise, and to travel on their own terms. But these victories were not easy. The shift in fashion wasn't just about clothes, it was about changing attitudes, about breaking down centuries of tradition. Women who chose to wear divided skirts, looser corsets, and health clothing were often ostracized, dismissed as radical, unfashionable, or even immoral. The pressures were immense, and the social expectations were deeply ingrained. Women were expected to sacrifice comfort, health, and even their ability to move freely for the sake of appearance. Still, as more women began to embrace practical, comfortable fashion, they found that they were not alone. Supportive networks of women, though small at first, began to form, advocating for change. These networks offered advice, shared stories, and provided emotional and social support to those brave enough to reject the corset. These women formed the foundation for later movements that would challenge not only the physical restrictions of clothing, but also the social structures that upheld them. Small victories began to accumulate. Women started to notice the difference in their health. They felt better. They could breathe without struggle, walk without pain, and move with a freedom they had never known before. But it wasn't just about comfort, it was about empowerment. Women realized that by rejecting restrictive fashion, they were also rejecting the societal norms that had confined them for centuries. This wasn't just a matter of clothing, it was a statement about what women were capable of. The movement for healthier clothing didn't just stop with the Rational Dress Society. Over the following decades, the push for more comfortable, functional clothing continued to grow. More women began to demand clothing that supported their bodies rather than constricted them. Cycling attire became an essential part of the new, active lifestyle for women, and the idea of mobility began to spread. Women were no longer expected to be delicate and frail. They were expected to be strong, active, and capable of navigating the world on their own terms. The idea that women could move freely, unburdened by layers of fabric and iron, was empowering, and it laid the foundation for greater social and political freedoms. At the end of the 19th century, the world was on the brink of an electrifying transformation. What had once been the domain of gas lamps and horse-drawn carts was now giving way to the hum of electric light bulbs and the whir of modern appliances. The transition was nothing short of revolutionary. But with every spark of progress came a shadow, the emergence of new risks, new dangers that had not been fully understood or contained. The promises of convenience and efficiency were enticing, but they carried a cost that would become increasingly apparent as technology and society collided. The introduction of electricity to the home was perhaps the most significant leap in domestic technology. Imagine the first flicker of an electric bulb in a living room, replacing the dim, flickering light of a gas lamp. The possibilities seemed endless. No longer would households need to rely on smoky, unpredictable flames that could suffocate the air or cause fires at a moment's notice. Electricity was clean, efficient, and at first glance, safe. Along with electricity came a host of new household appliances designed to make life easier, faster, and more efficient. The electric iron was one of the first appliances to gain widespread popularity. No longer would women need to heat irons on stoves or use heavy metal devices that could burn clothes or fingers. The electric kettle, which could boil water in a fraction of the time it took on a stove, revolutionized the simple task of tea making. Refrigerators, though still in their infancy, began to replace the old iceboxes, allowing for longer storage of food and greater convenience in meal preparation. Electric fans swept away the sweltering heat of summer, bringing a refreshing breeze into the home. Each of these innovations, while initially met with enthusiasm, represented not just progress but also the birth of new hazards. The electric iron was a marvel of efficiency, but it came with its own risks. Overheated elements could ignite fabrics, and faulty wiring could lead to dangerous shocks. The early electric kettles were known to overheat and explode, sending boiling water into unsuspecting hands. But perhaps the most alarming of all was the electric fan. While it brought much-needed relief during hot months, early models were far from safe. The exposed wires were prone to short-circuiting, leading to a terrifying number of electrocution incidents. Each new appliance seemed to bring with it the potential for disaster. Refrigerators, the technological wonder of their day, promised to change the way people stored food. Before their arrival, families relied on ice boxes, which required the regular delivery of ice, an expensive and inefficient process. Refrigerators, powered by electricity, could keep food fresh for much longer periods, saving both money and time. But as with all innovations, the early models were rife with danger. Many of these early refrigerators used toxic refrigerants like ammonia or sulfur dioxide, which, if leaked, could poison the household or cause deadly accidents. The dangers of these chemicals were often underestimated, and it wasn't until decades later that safer alternatives were developed. But it wasn't just the appliances themselves that posed risks, it was the very nature of electricity. For most of the 19th century, electricity was a mysterious and dangerous force, its full potential yet to be understood. As more homes adopted electric power, the hazards multiplied. Faulty wiring, overloaded circuits, and poor insulation became increasingly common, as people rushed to embrace the new technology without fully grasping its risks. In homes across England and America, families eagerly embraced electric lighting, only to discover that their wiring was inadequate to handle the demand. Fires, once a threat from gas lamps, now spread through homes due to faulty electrical systems. Electrocution became a real concern, as wires short-circuited or as poorly grounded appliances shocked unsuspecting users. The dangers of electricity weren't just theoretical, they were tangible, immediate, and terrifying. This surge in new technology also brought with it a rising awareness. Innovation breeds risk. The more a society progressed, the more it required vigilance and oversight to protect against the dangers of its inventions. As electric lights and household appliances became more widespread, safety regulations were slowly introduced, though often too late to prevent the early disasters. Local governments, previously slow to react, began drafting building codes that incorporated safety measures for electrical wiring. Fire brigades adapted, learning how to handle the new dangers of electrical fires. But even with these precautions, there was a deep-seated anxiety about the unforeseen consequences of progress. At the same time, new appliances began to change how women interacted with their homes. The electric iron, for example, while undeniably more efficient than its predecessors, was often used for more than just clothing. The sheer pressure on women to maintain a perfect home, clean, neat, organized, and properly adorned only intensified with the arrival of such gadgets. Suddenly, the home wasn't just a space for living, it was a space for showcasing how well one could handle these new conveniences, how well one could perform the role of a dutiful, efficient, and perfect housekeeper. This gave rise to what could be called a new kind of anxiety, not just about physical discomfort, but about performance. The idea that women had to keep up with the ever-evolving technological landscape, and that failing to do so reflected poorly on their worth as wives and mothers, was another invisible burden they carried. Appliances that promised ease and comfort only exacerbated the pressure to maintain perfection. Behind the excitement of technological progress, however, was a deep contradiction. Yes, electricity and household appliances made life more efficient in many ways, but they also introduced dangers that required constant caution. Progress came with new risks: the risk of electrocution, the risk of fire, the risk of poisoning from toxic chemicals. The irony was that these innovations, which were supposed to improve daily life, also demanded new kinds of vigilance and sacrifice. The same electricity that illuminated homes and powered appliances could just as easily kill. The increasing awareness of these hazards didn't immediately lead to widespread safety improvements. Early experiments with electricity, like electric street lighting, often resulted in accidents and public fears. Women were the primary victims of faulty appliances, as they were the ones who interacted most frequently with household devices. Their health and safety were once again treated as secondary to the demands of beauty, comfort, and social performance. Despite these risks, the societal shift was unmistakable. The introduction of electricity and household appliances marked a new era, one where progress was no longer optional but expected. Women began to rely on these devices more and more, making the domestic sphere both easier and more dangerous to navigate. The introduction of new technology meant women had to adapt quickly, learning not just how to operate the devices but how to do so safely. The rewards of convenience were overshadowed by the lurking dangers of misuse, faulty wiring, and chemical exposure. In the midst of this technological revolution, a new understanding emerged. Progress and innovation could not be fully embraced without acknowledgement of the risks they carried. It became clear that while technology could bring great benefits, it could also bring great harm if not properly managed. The challenge, then, was to balance progress with responsibility, to ensure that the pursuit of convenience did not come at the expense of safety. In this way, the end of the 19th century marked the beginning of an ongoing conversation about innovation, one that recognized its potential for both greatness and destruction. The Victorian era, with its suffocating corsets, impractical fashion, and relentless social expectations, gave way to a new age of promise, hope, and change. As the turn of the century ushered in the Edwardian era, a subtle but profound shift began to take place. For the first time in generations, women were given more freedom to breathe, to move, and to exist in a way that was not dictated by the rigid standards of the past. The restrictive fashion of the Victorian era began to loosen its hold, and with it, the health and well-being of women began to improve. In the Edwardian era, fashion evolved significantly. The tightly laced corset that had been synonymous with femininity for centuries started to lose its dominance. It didn't disappear overnight, but the slow but steady shift toward healthier clothing began. The hourglass figure, once achieved by forceful constriction of the waist, was now attained through garments that allowed for more mobility and comfort. Corsets were loosened, their steel ribs replaced by softer materials, their laces slightly less tight. Daughters who had watched their mothers struggle against the unrelenting pressure of corsetry found themselves experiencing a new kind of freedom. They didn't have to wear the same painful garments that their mothers had endured, and their wardrobes gradually included more functional, breathable clothing. For the first time, they were allowed the option of mobility, the ability to stand, sit, and move without feeling like their ribs might crack under the pressure of their corsets. While the ideal waist size still loomed over them, measuring at 18 to 20 inches for most women, it was no longer seen as a strict necessity. But this was not just a change in fashion, it was a change in mindset. The women of the Edwardian era began to embrace healthier standards, not just in clothing but in lifestyle. The idea that a woman's worth was tied to her physical discomfort slowly began to unravel. Women were encouraged to be active, to engage in sports and outdoor activities, an idea that had been practically forbidden during the Victorian era. Cycling, once a rare and controversial activity for women, became a popular pastime. The introduction of bicycle skirts, loose, practical clothing that allowed women to ride bicycles comfortably, was a symbol of this new freedom. Women could now move with ease, without feeling bound by layers of restrictive clothing, or the threat of public scorn for daring to wear pants or less restrictive garments. As the Rational Dress Society and other progressive movements gained traction, the idea that women could have control over their bodies that had long been corseted, constricted, and bound, was now being acknowledged. For the first time, fashion was no longer seen as a battle between beauty and practicality. Women, particularly in the upper and middle classes, were beginning to choose clothing that suited their needs rather than conforming to unattainable ideals. This was a social and cultural victory, a small but powerful rebellion against the weight of centuries-old fashion traditions. At the heart of this revolution were the educational and advocacy movements that began to blossom during this time. The Rational Dress Society wasn't the only organization pushing for change. Others, such as the Women's Social and Political Union, worked toward broader issues of women's rights and autonomy, using fashion as one area where small victories could have a ripple effect on women's health, freedoms, and place in society. These movements inspired future generations of women to demand more autonomy over their own bodies, not just in what they wore, but in how they moved through the world. Girls growing up in the Edwardian era didn't experience the same kind of painful indoctrination into restrictive fashion that their mothers did. As corsetry loosened and more practical clothing options emerged, these girls were able to breathe easier, literally and figuratively. They were no longer expected to shrink their bodies to fit an ideal that was, frankly, impossible to maintain without serious health consequences. They could run, jump, cycle, and swim. They could dance without feeling like they would faint at any moment. In short, they had more freedom to exist as their natural bodies allowed them, rather than as an idealized version of themselves constructed from steel and fabric. This generational change didn't happen overnight, of course. Change was slow and often incremental. Many women still wore corsets throughout the Edwardian era, though they were less restrictive and more focused on shaping the body than suffocating it. The ideal of a tiny waist remained, but it was no longer as stringent a requirement for social acceptance. Still, the Edwardian era was marked by progress, small victories that laid the foundation for future generations of women to embrace their bodies as they were, rather than forcing them into a mold. The social impact of these shifts was profound. Women no longer had to feel like their physical discomfort was a reflection of their worth. They could step outside, engage in social activities, and take up hobbies without feeling the weight of societal judgment. The introduction of sports for women, though still limited, became a significant part of this new cultural landscape. Women began to play tennis, golf, and even row. These activities weren't just for men anymore. They were a chance for women to test their limits, their physical capabilities, and ultimately their right to live without restriction. By the time the First World War began, the early foundations of the modern woman were already in place. Women had learned to push back against fashion norms that prioritized discomfort over practicality. They had fought to be seen as more than just objects of beauty, but as people who had the right to their own bodies, their own health, and their own autonomy. While the war itself would shift these gains into overdrive, the Edwardian era had already begun to prepare women for greater freedom in all aspects of their lives. However, it's important to remember that this wasn't just a fashion revolution. This was a broader social change, one that challenged not just what women wore, but how they moved through the world. Fashion was never merely about appearances. It was about power, autonomy, and societal expectation. The loosening of the corset, the acceptance of more practical clothing, and the rise of women in sports and other previously male-dominated spaces was a direct challenge to the patriarchal structures that had dictated women's lives for centuries. Women were slowly but surely reclaiming their agency, asserting their right to live freely, and pushing back against the idea that their worth was measured by the tightness of their waistline. The Victorian era's beauty standards were more than just a set of aesthetic ideals. They were a system of physical, mental, and social constraints that shaped the lives of women in ways both visible and hidden. The corset, that symbol of femininity and social status, was the most notorious tool of this control. It squeezed women's waists to unnatural sizes, compressed their internal organs, restricted their breathing, and left a trail of health problems that spanned generations. But it wasn't just the corset, it was the entire machinery of Victorian beauty. The deadly cosmetics, the excruciating hairstyles, the suffocating social expectations, all of it created a world where women's bodies were seen as vessels to be shaped, molded, and displayed for the pleasure of society. And yet, despite these overwhelming pressures, there were pockets of resistance. The seeds of change were sown through incremental actions, small rebellions that gradually chipped away at the suffocating norms. The Rational Dress Society, though derided by many, began to advocate for clothing that allowed women to breathe, move, and live without fear of fainting. Cycling attire, looser corsets, and health-conscious garments became symbols of progress, proof that women didn't have to sacrifice their well-being for the sake of fashion. These early steps were not without opposition, but they laid the groundwork for greater changes in the decades that followed. The adoption of safer practices, though slow, marked the beginning of a new era where women's health was considered more important than their ability to fit into a societal mold. Technology, from the electric iron to the advent of cycling, offered women the chance to live more freely, to participate in activities once thought inaccessible. These innovations, while not without their own risks, provided women with the tools to redefine their roles in society. The technological and social shifts of the Victorian era created a foundation for the modern world, one in which women could move, breathe, and choose their own paths without the suffocating constraints of past ideals. Yet these changes came with a bittersweet recognition. New risks emerged alongside progress. As women gained more freedom, they were also exposed to new dangers. Electricity brought safety, but also electrocution. Labor-saving devices promised convenience, but also fire hazards. The constant push for progress was a delicate balance between innovation and oversight, between the promise of a better life and the reality of unforeseen consequences. Women had to navigate not only the constraints of the old world, but the uncertainties of a new one. However, despite these challenges, the legacy of the Victorian struggle is clear. Modern freedoms in fashion, health, and personal agency are built upon the foundation laid by those who fought for autonomy over their own bodies. The movements for rational dress, suffrage, and health reform all stemmed from this early resistance. The women who pushed for better alternatives were not just fighting for their own comfort, they were fighting for the right to live without the constant weight of societal expectations. They were fighting for future generations to be able to breathe, move, and live freely. Change, as history shows us, often begins with small acts of courage. Each time a woman loosened her corset, skipped the arsenic wafer, or dared to wear a practical skirt, she was making a stand against a centuries-old system that tried to define her worth. These acts of advocacy, both public and private, were the seeds of a larger transformation. They showed that change does not have to be loud or sweeping to be powerful. It can begin with one person, one choice, one small rebellion. And as the generations progressed, these small acts of courage gave birth to greater social movements. culminating in the freedoms women enjoy today. The message is clear. Change begins with informed choices, with the courage to question, and with the relentless pursuit of a future where no one's body is shaped solely for the sake of others' approval. These small acts of resistance created a ripple effect that has lasted for generations. The struggle for freedom in fashion and health has evolved, but it still carries the lessons of the past. That progress is hard, one, that every step forward is built on the shoulders of those who dared to push against the weight of societal norms. And so, as we look back on the Victorian era and all the suffering it inflicted, let us also remember the women who fought to breathe easier, to live fuller lives, and to create space for future generations to make their own choices. Their courage, their rebellion, and their persistence paved the way for the freedoms we often take for granted today. It is their legacy that continues to shape the world we live in, a world where women no longer have to suffer in silence for the sake of beauty.